Do you feel the emptiness, that silence that lingers when someone who saw your soul steps away? That's not just absence, it's the universe knocking on your heart, asking you to awaken. For too long, you've hidden behind walls, built with fear, built with the illusion that distance protects you. But the truth is, the walls never shield you from the hunger inside for connection, for understanding, for love that doesn't demand perfection. When the imperfection, it is revelation. It is the mirror you refuse to look into. And now, standing in that mirror, you cannot escape yourself. The avoidance, the deflections, the careful silence, they all confront you at once. And in that confrontation lies power. The power to see yourself without illusion, to feel without restraint, to understand that vulnerability is not weakness. It is divine strength. You realize, perhaps too late, that the love you brushed aside was not ordinary. It was sacred. It was the kind that asks nothing, yet gives everything. And yet it required you to show up fully. And you weren't ready. But readiness is not given. It is earned. And loss is its most uncompromising teacher. Pain, though it feels heavy, is your awakening. It strips away the pretense, strips away the numbness, and forces you into the raw reality of who you are. Here, in the quiet echo of someone's departure, you begin to feel what you've long denied, the stirrings of empathy, the pulse of compassion, the courage to meet your own heart. This is the silent awakening, the one that transforms avoidance into understanding, distance into presence, fear into wisdom. You cannot rewind what was lost, nor should you try, but you can rise from it. You can take these lessons, etched deep into your spirit, and let them shape the next chapter of your life. A chapter where connection is not a threat but a gift, where emotions are not enemies but allies, where love is not fleeting but anchored in truth and consciousness. So embrace the absence, listen to the silence. It speaks the language you've ignored for far too long. And in that listening, you will awaken, not just to the love you let go, but to the love you are capable of giving when the walls finally come down and your heart finally opens. The empath walked away, yes, but in that leaving, they left a doorway, and it is yours to step through. Imagine standing in a room and suddenly noticing it's empty. The presence that once filled the space with warmth, with understanding, with quiet knowing, it's gone. That emptiness, that absence is not just physical, it is a spiritual mirror reflecting what you've been avoiding all along. The departure of an empath is a force that cannot be ignored, a subtle but powerful wake-up call. For the avoidant, it is often the first time they are confronted with the consequences of their emotional distance. For years, they have cultivated safety behind walls of detachment, convincing themselves that keeping others at arm's length shields them from pain. They have perfected avoidance as an art form, convincing themselves that silence, withdrawal, and emotional absence protect them. But when the empath walks away, those walls no longer serve their purpose. Suddenly, the emptiness is not a choice. It is a reality that must be faced. The power of absence lies in its ability to illuminate truths that words alone cannot convey. The avoidant is forced to recognize what has always been there, but was carefully ignored, the depth of connection they are capable of experiencing, and the richness of emotion they have denied themselves. In the empath's presence, feelings can be mirrored, acknowledged, and reflected back with clarity and tenderness. Their leaving exposes the void, revealing how much the avoidant has relied on distraction and self-protection to avoid facing themselves. This is the quiet force of absence. It does not yell, it does not demand. It simply exists, creating space for awareness to arise. When the empath departs, the avoidant often experiences an initial wave of confusion and denial. They may question the fairness of it, feeling abandoned or misunderstood. Yet beneath that surface lies the first stirrings of self-awareness. Absence has a way of forcing reflection, a gentle insistence that you turn inward. It strips away the noise, the excuses, and the justifications, leaving a raw confrontation with reality. The avoidant begins to notice the subtle ways they pushed love away, the moments when their fear of intimacy overshadowed their desire for connection. It is not pleasant, and it may bring discomfort, but it is necessary. The absence of the empath acts as a spotlight on the areas of life that have long been neglected: emotional responsiveness, vulnerability, and the willingness to be fully present. What is often underestimated is that absence is not merely a void, it is an invitation. It invites the avoidant to feel what they have denied, to reckon with the patterns that have governed their relationships, and to reconsider their understanding of love and connection. It teaches that avoidance, while protective in the short term, eventually leads to emptiness that cannot be filled by distraction, control, or superficial connection. The empath's departure demonstrates that the love they once had was not conditional on performance or perfection. It was based on presence, empathy, and genuine emotional engagement. And in losing it, the avoidant faces the undeniable truth that these qualities are essential for meaningful connection, not optional, not secondary, not negotiable. Absence also carries a subtle spiritual lesson. It is the universe's way of showing that attachment, while powerful, must be balanced with awareness. It forces the avoidant to confront the fact that they have been living in the shadow of their own fear, running from vulnerability as though it were an enemy. The empath's leaving is not a punishment. It is a mirror reflecting what avoidance has cost them: intimacy, growth, and the richness of authentic human experience. The silent room, the empty spaces, and the quiet moments are all teachers, showing that presence, both giving and receiving, is a sacred responsibility, a privilege, and ultimately the path to awakening. Through the power of absence, the avoidant has the rare opportunity to witness themselves unguarded, to face what has been hidden in plain sight. Every ache, every longing, every whisper of regret becomes a lesson. It is the quietest yet most profound catalyst for change. And in that emptiness, there lies the first spark of awakening, the recognition that true connection is not a threat to autonomy, but a conduit to wholeness, and that the walls nature relied upon may now be the very barriers that keep them from becoming fully alive. For much of their lives, avoidants have mastered the art of hiding from themselves, from others, and from the truth of their own hearts. They have built invisible fortresses around their emotions, carefully shielding themselves from vulnerability, intimacy, and the raw, sometimes messy experience of connection. They have learned to avoid discomfort, to divert attention away from emotional depth, and to convince themselves that emotional distance is the safest form of self-preservation. Yet, the departure of an empath shatters this illusion. When the empath walks away, the avoidant is forced to confront the shadows they have long ignored, the parts of themselves that fear exposure, that crave connection yet resist it, that hide behind defenses while longing for authenticity. Facing these inner shadows is not a gentle process. It is uncomfortable, disorienting, and often frightening. Avoidants are suddenly confronted with emotions that they have spent years suppressing or rationalizing away. Feelings of loss, regret, guilt, and even longing emerge, uninvited and unavoidable. The absence of the empath acts like a mirror held up to the avoidant's soul, reflecting not just the consequences of their avoidance, but the very patterns that have defined their approach to relationships. Every unacknowledged fear, every defensive mechanism, every small act of self-protection that once seemed prudent now appears stark and undeniable. The quietness left behind by the empath's departure demands recognition, compelling the avoidant to sit with feelings they have long considered dangerous, unnecessary, or inconvenient. In this confrontation, the avoidant may experience a deep sense of discomfort and resistance. There is a temptation to numb, to distract, to justify the avoidance once again. Yet, the power of facing these shadows lies precisely in resisting that urge. By acknowledging the fears, the avoidance patterns, and the emotional blind spots, the avoidant begins to see themselves more clearly. They recognize the walls they've built not as protection, but as barriers that prevent real connection and personal growth. Every pattern of detachment, every refusal to engage emotionally, is laid bare, and in that revelation lies the first spark of transformation. This process of facing the inner shadows is also deeply instructive. It illuminates the ways in which avoidance has been both a coping mechanism and a limitation. Avoidants often pride themselves on independence, self-sufficiency, and emotional control. Yet these very qualities can become a trap. Avoidance creates distance not only from others but from the self. The empath's departure forces the avoidant to feel what they have long refused to feel, to witness the depth of their own capacity for love, empathy, and vulnerability. In doing so, they are confronted with the paradox they have been living, that their very defenses, intended to protect, have also isolated them from the experiences that give life its richness and meaning. There is a subtle wisdom in this process. Avoidants are not being punished for their distance. They are being invited to awaken. The shadows that emerge when the empath leaves are not enemies. They are teachers. They show what has been denied, neglected, or hidden, and they offer a pathway toward growth, self-awareness, and emotional maturity. Every pang of regret, every ache of longing, every realization of what was lost becomes a stepping stone toward understanding the full spectrum of human connection. The avoidant begins to see that true intimacy is not a threat to independence, that vulnerability is not weakness, and that emotional honesty is not something to fear, but something to embrace. Ultimately, the process of facing inner shadows allows the avoidant to move from ignorance to awareness, from denial to acceptance, and from avoidance to authentic engagement with life and relationships. It is in this space, raw and unguarded, that transformation begins. The empath's absence, once perceived as loss or rejection, becomes a catalyst for deep self-discovery. The avoidant learns that true strength lies not in emotional distance, but in courage. The courage to face themselves, to embrace vulnerability, and to allow love, empathy, and connection to enter, not as a threat, but as a conduit for growth, healing, and awakening. For years, the avoidant moves through life with a sense of careful detachment, a belief that emotional intimacy is risky, even dangerous. They often minimize, deflect, or dismiss the depth of connection that empaths offer, thinking that distance preserves freedom and protects them from vulnerability. They may even convince themselves that they are immune to attachment, that feelings are optional, or that love can be measured and controlled. Yet when the empath finally walks away, the avoidant is confronted with a truth that no amount of logic, distraction, or rationalization can erase. The value of true connection is undeniable. In that absence, the avoidant sees, perhaps for the first time, the depth, purity, and irreplaceable nature of the bond they took for granted. This realization often arrives subtly at first. It might begin as a quiet ache in the chest, a lingering thought, or a restless sense of incompleteness. The avoidant may notice the empty space left behind, the subtle silences, the absence of someone who understood them in ways they never allowed themselves to acknowledge. That absence is a revelation, a reminder that what was once present was not ordinary, it was rare, precious, and profoundly meaningful. The empath's presence was a mirror to their soul, a reflection of the capacities for love, understanding, and emotional depth that the avoidant often hid even from themselves. And now, without that mirror, they are faced with the reality of what they allowed to slip away. The process of recognizing the depth of true connection can be both painful and transformative. Pain arises because the avoidant is forced to see the consequences of their avoidance, the patterns of detachment, the avoidance of vulnerability, the insistence on independence above intimacy. All of it becomes clear in the stark light of absence. But alongside this pain comes understanding. For the first time, they may begin to grasp what it feels like to be seen fully, to be accepted, and to be met with compassion rather than judgment. They may realize that love was not conditional on their performance, their independence, or their ability to withhold, but was instead offered freely, fully, and without expectation. This realization is humbling, yet it is also profoundly enlightening. What is remarkable about this awakening is that it is not imposed externally. It emerges naturally from the experience of loss. The avoidant cannot hide from it, cannot distract themselves from it, and cannot rationalize it away. The absence of the empath forces self-reflection and compels the avoidant to acknowledge the depth of what they had. In that acknowledgement, a door opens. The door to self-awareness, emotional maturity, and the capacity for deeper connection. They begin to see that avoidance may have offered temporary comfort, but it cannot replace the fulfillment found in authentic connection. They recognize that the love they took for granted was not something to control or contain. It was a gift meant to awaken them to their own capacity for empathy, intimacy, and vulnerability. This moment of realization also carries an important spiritual lesson. It teaches that human connection is sacred, that relationships are mirrors reflecting our own growth, and that the absence of someone who truly sees us is not simply a loss, but an invitation to awaken. The avoidant begins to understand that the depth of connection they dismissed was in truth an opportunity for transformation, a chance to learn that love is not a threat, but a teacher, that intimacy is not a trap, but a teacher, but a pathway to self-discovery, and that true connection cannot be measured, manipulated, or avoided without cost. As this understanding deepens, the avoidant may begin to internalize the lesson of presence. They recognize that true connection requires engagement, vulnerability, and honesty. They see that the empath's departure was not a rejection, but a reflection of the boundaries and integrity that the avoidant themselves had resisted. And in that reflection, they begin to awaken, not just to the love they lost, but to the love they are capable of experiencing in the future, should they choose to embrace authenticity, presence, and emotional courage. When the empath walks away, the avoidant is left alone. Not just in the physical sense, but in a way that forces them to confront themselves fully. For years, they have relied on distraction, logic, and emotional distance to navigate life, believing that these strategies protect them from the vulnerabilities of deep connection. Yet, in the empath's absence, the carefully constructed armor begins to crack. The quiet space left behind becomes a mirror, reflecting not only the absence of another person, but also the absence of self-awareness. For the avoidant, this is the beginning of a profound journey, an opportunity to pause, reflect, and examine the patterns that have shaped their relationships and their lives. Self-reflection is rarely comfortable for the avoidant. They are often conditioned to avoid an introspection, to fear what might emerge if they truly look inward. The empath's departure, however, removes the possibility of distraction. There is no one else to blame, no external noise to drown out the inner dialogue, and no immediate escape from the emotional reality. Yea, they have long evaded. In this space, reflection becomes unavoidable. Every thought, every feeling, and every past interaction comes under scrutiny. They begin to see the ways they withdrew when love demanded presence, how they avoided intimacy when closeness required vulnerability, and how fear dictated their actions more than reason or desire. This period of self-reflection is transformative because it uncovers patterns that were previously invisible. Avoidants may begin to notice recurring themes: the tendency to pull away when emotions deepen, the compulsion to prioritize independence over connection, and the habit of minimizing others' feelings to maintain control. Each realization is a revelation, exposing both the protective mechanisms they relied on and the costs of those mechanisms. The empath's absence highlights what has been lost, not only in relationships, but also in the internal landscape of the avoidant themselves. They begin to understand that avoidance, while once comforting, has led to emptiness, missed opportunities, and the inability to fully experience love and connection. Self-reflection also introduces the avoidant to accountability. For the first time, they may confront the consequences of their choices without the filters of deflection or denial. They see how emotional unavailability hurt the very people who cared for them most, and how their fear. That vulnerability prevented them from forming meaningful bonds. This is not a process of self-punishment, but a process of awakening. Through reflection, the avoidant begins to recognize that growth is possible, that change is within their grasp, and that understanding their own behaviors is the first step toward transformation. Importantly, self-reflection teaches the avoidant about emotional depth and capacity. In the absence of the empath, they can examine not only what they have done, but also what they are capable of feeling. They may discover empathy where they had denied it, remorse where they had ignored it, and a longing for connection that surpasses fear. Reflection allows them to confront the dissonance between who they are and who they want to be, creating fertile ground for growth. It reveals that avoidance is not permanent, that walls can be dismantled, and that emotional courage is a skill that can be cultivated with awareness and intention. The beauty of this self-reflective awakening is that it is entirely voluntary, even if it is triggered by loss. The avoidant has a choice to ignore the lessons, continue the patterns, and live in emotional isolation, or to embrace the discomfort, learn from the absence, and grow into a more conscious, present, and compassionate person. Self-reflection is the catalyst for this transformation. It allows the avoidant to see their real life and their relationships with clarity, to understand the underlying motivations behind their avoidance, and to envision a path forward where connection is not feared but embraced. Through this introspection, the avoidant begins to grasp the profound truth that love, vulnerability, and emotional presence are not threats. They are the foundation of a fulfilled and meaningful life. The empath's departure, though painful, becomes the teacher, and self-reflection becomes the gateway. In these moments of quiet contemplation, the avoidant begins to awaken to the possibility of change, the capacity for authentic connection, and the realization that the journey inward is as important and as transformative as any relationship outward. When the empath walks away, the avoidant is thrust into an unfamiliar and often unsettling territory, the terrain of their own heart. For years, they may have suppressed or ignored the currents of empathy that naturally exist within them, believing that sensitivity equates to vulnerability, that emotional attunement is a weakness rather than a strength. The departure of the empath, however, acts as a catalyst, stirring what has long been dormant. In their absence, the avoidant begins to feel not just loss, but the subtle, almost imperceptible echoes of emotions they had once turned away from: longing, regret, compassion, and the recognition of another's pain. This awakening is quiet at first, a gentle whisper in the soul, yet it carries transformative power. Dormant empathy emerges because the avoidant is confronted with the tangible consequences of emotional distance. They begin to notice the ripple effects of their absence, the ways in which their withdrawal impacted the life of the empath, the bond that once existed, and the moments of care that were never fully acknowledged. In facing these truths, the avoidant is forced to step into the perspective of another, even if only in reflection. For the first time, they see the world through someone else's eyes, understanding the subtle heartbreaks, disappointments, and unmet needs that were previously invisible to them. Empathy, long asleep, begins to awaken because it is called upon by experience, by absence, by reflection, and by the undeniable truth that connection was lost. This awakening is not merely intellectual, it is deeply felt. The avoidant begins to sense the weight of what they avoided, to experience the emotional resonance of care, attunement, and love. There is a growing awareness that relationships are not transactions, that love is not about control or distance, but about presence, understanding, and mutual regard. They may feel the pang of regret for moments where their fear overruled their capacity for compassion, for the times they prioritized self-protectio, and over shared vulnerability. These feelings, while uncomfortable, serve as a doorway into the avoidant's own humanity, revealing a depth they had denied themselves for far too long. As dormant empathy awakens, the avoidant begins to recognize patterns they had repeated unconsciously. They see how their avoidance may have inadvertently caused pain to those who cared deeply for them, and they begin to understand that emotional attunement is not a liability, it is a gift. The departure of the empath forces them to confront the interconnectedness of human experience, the way emotions ripple outward, and the profound effect presence and absence can have on others. Slowly, they start to feel a sense of responsibility, not imposed externally, but arising naturally from awareness for how their actions impact those around them. This process also teaches humility. The avoidant realizes that life is richer, fuller, and more meaningful when empathy is allowed to flourish. They may begin to acknowledge the limitations they placed on themselves, the self-imposed barriers that kept them from engaging deeply with others. In doing so, a quiet transformation begins. Avoidance gives way to attentiveness, indifference to awareness, and detachment to compassion. It is not an overnight shift. Awakening empathy is gradual, subtle, and often accompanied by waves of self-reflection and emotional confrontation. Yet each small recognition, each tender awareness of another's feelings strengthens the capacity to connect authentically. In the absence of the empath, the avoidant discovers that empathy is not external. It has always been a part of them. It simply needed space, experience, and reflection to emerge. They begin to understand that being emotionally attuned does not diminish autonomy, nor does vulnerability threaten strength. Instead, empathy becomes a bridge between the avoidant and themselves, between the avoidant and others, and between absence and presence. Through this awakening, they realize that emotional intelligence, compassion, and attunement are not luxuries, but essential components of meaningful human connection. Ultimately, the departure of the empath awakens the avoidant to the depth of their own heart. What was once dormant now stirs with life, offering the promise of growth, transformation, and the ability to engage with the world more fully. In this silent awakening, the avoidant begins to see that empathy is not only a tool for understanding others, it is a key to understanding themselves, a pathway to healing, and a doorway to deeper, more authentic relationships in the future. Heartbreak has a unique way of demanding attention. For the avoidant who has spent much of their life protecting themselves from the intensity of emotion, the departure of an empath is not merely a loss. It is a confrontation with the reality of what they have been avoiding. The pain that emerges is sharp, undeniable, and sometimes overwhelming. Yet within that very pain lies a profound opportunity, the chance to transform what feels like suffering into a powerful teacher, a guide that illuminates the path toward emotional growth, self-awareness, and authentic connection. Pain, in this sense, becomes sacred. It is not punishment, but a divine messenger, showing the avoidant what they have ignored, suppressed, or dismissed for far too long. When the empath leaves, the avoidant is faced with the consequences of avoidance in the starkest terms. No amount of distraction, rationalization, or withdrawal can fill the emptiness left behind. The heart, which they have long kept at arm's length, now aches with the reality of its own capacity for feeling. It is a raw, unfiltered confrontation with self. The truth of what they wanted, what they lost, and what they are capable of if they allow themselves to be vulnerable. This is where transformation begins, when pain is recognized not as a threat, but as a teacher. Each pang of regret, each wave of longing, and each quiet moment of reflection becomes a lesson, offering insight into the patterns that have kept them from love, empathy, and connection. The avoidant begins to understand that avoidance, while once a shield, is also a limitation. The walls they built to protect themselves from perceived threats now prevent them from experiencing the fullness of life. Pain illuminates this paradox. It shows that emotional distancing may have created temporary comfort, but it has also created emptiness and disconnection. By facing the heartbreak directly, the avoidant begins to see their patterns with clarity. How fear of intimacy led to withdrawal, how self-protection led to isolation, and how avoidance, though familiar, has its cost. This awareness is painful, yes, but it is also transformative, for it opens the door to change. Heartbreak teaches the avoidant that emotional growth is not optional. It is necessary. They realize that love is not something to be controlled, avoided, or contained, but something to be experienced, felt, and integrated. Pain becomes the conduit through which empathy awakens, through which self-reflection deepens, and through which the avoidant can begin to cultivate emotional maturity. Each moment of suffering carries within it the seed of insight, the recognition that vulnerability is strength, that connection is sacred, and that avoiding these truths only delays growth and fulfillment. Transformation through pain also requires courage. It asks the avoidant to lean into discomfort, to feel what they have long resisted, and to acknowledge the emotional truths they have ignored. There is no shortcut, no way to bypass this process, for the lessons are embedded in the experience itself. Yet, as the avoidant engages with their heartbreak consciously, they begin to reclaim what was once hidden, their capacity for love, their awareness of interconnection, and their ability to respond to life with presence rather than avoidance. Pain becomes a mirror, reflecting both what has been lost and what can be gained through intentional growth. Ultimately, heartbreak is not the end. It is a doorway. The avoidant learns that what initially feels like loss is, in truth, a sacred opportunity for awakening. The empath's departure, the ache in the heart, and the confrontation with vulnerability all combine to create a transformative experience. Through pain, the avoidant discovers that emotional awareness, empathy, and authentic connection are not threats, but essential aspects of human life. Heartbreak, when embraced as a teacher rather than resisted as an enemy, becomes the pathway to self-discovery, growth, and the ability to engage fully with love, both within themselves and with others. After the empath walks away, and the avoidant has confronted absence, faced their inner shadow, says, reflected deeply, awakened dormant empathy, and allowed heartbreak to teach its lessons, they arrive at a critical juncture, the moment of integration. This is where understanding transforms into wisdom, pain transforms into growth, and awareness transforms into action. Integration is not merely about acknowledging the lessons. It is about embodying them, allowing them to reshape the avoidance approach to relationships, life, and the self. It is the point where transformation becomes visible, not just internally, but in the way they engage with the world and others. Integration begins with acceptance. The avoidant must fully recognize that what occurred, the loss, the absence, the patterns of avoidance, is neither a punishment nor a failure. It is a reflection, a mirror, and an opportunity. They learn to accept their past choices without self-condemnation, understanding that avoidance was a coping mechanism designed to protect them from perceived threats. This acceptance does not mean condoning detachment or denial. Rather, it means acknowledging that these behaviors were part of their journey and that every experience, no matter how painful, contributed to their growth. By embracing this perspective, the avoidant creates fertile ground for transformation. Next comes the conscious application of lessons learned. The avoidant begins to see how their previous patterns, pulling away, avoiding vulnerability, suppressing empathy, limited not only their relationships, but also their own personal development. They start to cultivate a new approach, one that balances self-protection with openness, independence with connection, and rationality with emotional awareness. They may practice expressing feelings with honesty, listening with presence, and allowing themselves to respond to love without fear or reservation. These shifts are deliberate, but they flow naturally from the internal work already undertaken. Integration transforms abstract insights into practical, lived experience. Growth also involves a renewed relationship with vulnerability. Where avoidance once reigned, courage now begins to emerge. The avoidant recognizes that vulnerability is not a liability, but a bridge, connecting them to others and to their own authentic self. They understand that emotional openness does not weaken them, it strengthens them by fostering connection, intimacy, and trust. The empath's departure has shown that love, when embraced fully, requires this openness. Integration, then, is about internalizing this truth, that authentic engagement with the world demands presence, courage, and empathy, and that these qualities can coexist with autonomy and self-respect. Spiritual growth is another dimension of integration. The avoidant begins to perceive relationships and emotions through a larger lens, seeing the empath's departure not as a mere personal loss, but as a part of the universal flow of life. They recognize that every interaction, every bond, and every separation carries lessons designed to elevate consciousness. Pain and absence are no longer solely obstacles. They are catalysts for awakening. Through reflection and application, the avoidant begins to embody a higher level of awareness, one that honors the sacredness of connection while maintaining the strength of self. Ultimately, integration leads to transformation that is visible and lasting. The avoidant emerges not merely as someone who has learned from loss, but as a person capable of sustaining deeper, more meaningful relationships. They understand that emotional intimacy is a gift, not a threat, that empathy is a strength, not a vulnerability, and that love requires presence, courage, and conscious engagement. Walls that once defined their existence are replaced with awareness and discernment. They are no longer merely avoiding pain, they are embracing growth, embodying love, and engaging fully with life. This stage of integration is the culmination of the Avoidant Silent Awakening. It represents a shift from fear to understanding, from isolation to connection, and from avoidance to authenticity. Every lesson from absence, reflection, empathy, and heartbreak is absorbed, transformed, and expressed in action. The avoidant becomes someone who can love without losing themselves, someone who can honor boundaries while embracing intimacy, and someone who recognizes that the path to fulfillment is paved with conscious engagement, emotional courage, and the willingness to grow from every experience. In this integration, they are no longer defined by what was lost. They are defined by the wisdom, strength, and love they carry forward, ready to create a future grounded in awareness, presence, and authentic connection. Thank you for trusting me with your journey today. Your growth and awareness inspire every step forward. Goodbye for now, and may your path be filled with courage, clarity, and authentic connection.